Release the Kraken!
Welcome back, fellow game designers. In our last video, we went ahead and created our bullet. So now we can fire some bullets. Yay! And these ones use basic translation. If you want to see how to do it using the physics system, you can refer back to how we moved our player. In this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and set up our enemy so that we have something to shoot. So up here, let's go ahead and create an empty object. I'm going to call this small enemy, because we're going to have a small enemy, a medium enemy, and then a boss. And inside my small enemy, I'm going to create a 3D object. I'm not sure what I want it to be, but for now, just to be different than our player, I guess I'll make it a cylinder. Yeah, that'll work. Now, I don't want my cylinder to have the collider, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the collider from the cylinder. So remove that. I'm going to make sure my cylinder is set to 0. And for the enemy, I'm going to go ahead and just make sure it is also set to 0. So up here, I'm going to reset the transform by right-clicking. Reset. And let's go into my game view so I can kind of see where that's going to be. I want my player to kind of start back here. Let me go ahead and just tear this off. There we go. So I want the player to start a little bit farther back, so I'll take him. Let me adjust my camera. I'll move my player back. That's pretty good. That's in my front axis. And then for my enemy, I'll go ahead and grab him. And I'll go ahead and move the enemy up toward the top of the screen here. That's pretty good. So it looks like 4.5 is a good position for the enemy to start. And then the player, he's starting negative 4.5, so minus 4.5. I'm going to take my small enemy, make sure that I put the capsule back on it. So I'm going to go ahead, so I'll do cylinder. Let's see what my collider options are. Collider. So I actually don't have a cylinder collider. So instead, I'm just going to use the capsule collider. That should be good enough. And actually, just to make it interesting, I'm going to remove the cylinder from here. And you can see the capsule is still there. I'm going to add a capsule instead. That way it matches. So capsule. And then on the capsule, let's remove the capsule collider. Whoops. And I'll add that back to the enemy. So the small enemy now has the capsule. And then for the actual size to fit, the radius is 0.5, but the original was 2 on the height. So I'll do 2. And now it fits. Now remember that the collider that we're using isn't going to matter all that much because we're going to change it later. And now we should be able to fire some shots at an enemy. So here I am. I can fire. Yay. But right now it's just passing on through. And the reason for that is we need to have our collider set to trigger. But we also need to add on a rigid body because Unity 3D objects do not detect collision without a rigid body. So let's go ahead and add that on. Now, the bullet does not need to have a rigid body. Only the object that is receiving collision needs to have it. So we can go ahead and just add that on to our component here. So this is going to be a rigid body, like so. We can turn off the gravity, and that's fine. Let's go ahead and make the code for our enemy. So I'll go ahead and right-click, create new script. And we're going to call this enemy base. And then hit enter. And go ahead and open that up. Now this is going to be our enemy base because we are going to base all of our enemies off of this. They're going to be derived from this. Now Unity has an option for scriptable objects. We're not going to deal with scriptable objects in this particular tutorial, but just want you to know that they do exist. But we are going to be benefiting from inheritance, which is a very powerful feature of the class data type. So inside of our enemy base, we need to have some information. We need to know the enemy health, and we want to have the ability for it to take some damage. So I'm going to make a private float. This is going to be health. And I don't really know what that's going to be just yet, but I'm going to set it to 100 just for the sake of doing so. I'm going to go ahead and remove the update and the start functions. I'm not going to need those. And I'll create a new function in here I'm going to do a void. This is going to be called take damage. And then we want to take in a damage amount. So a float damage amount. Then inside here, we're going to do health minus equals damage amount. Okay, let's go ahead and save our base class here. Let's jump back in, let it compile, and let's go ahead and create a new C# script. This is going to be for our small enemy, so small enemy. Let's open up our small enemy class. Now our small enemy class, you can see, does not have our take damage, but check this out. If I come into the small enemy, and just after the dots here, I add another colon, and just before it, I say that it inherits from the enemy base. Now my enemy base already has mono behavior on there, so it doesn't have to inherit it twice. I can remove mono behavior, like so. So now that we have that, let's come down into our script here. I'm going to go after the start function. I'm going to make a new spot. I'm going to call this collision. For my collision, I'm going to use the void on trigger, enter. Once I hit tab, it's going to fill that in for me. It's going to mark it as private. Just so you know, the default for any of these is private in C#. You can keep it or you can remove it. It doesn't matter because it will default to private. You should, best practices, mark them as either private or public, but I digress. I'm going to leave it as it is. And then inside of onTrigger enter, we have a collider. Whenever you're using a trigger, you're going to have a collider. And then the type of collider is going to be other. So the other thing we're colliding with. And in this case, we're going to be colliding with the bullet. So if other.tag is equal to bullet. Now you can specify any kind of tag here. Let's say you get hit by a bullet, you have a different behavior than if you got hit by a missile or a rocket or a frisbee. You could have the collider be checked to have a different type of behavior. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as bullet. And if we're hitting with the bullet, we are going to call our take damage function. So take damage. And then inside of our take damage, we need to know how much damage we are taking. Now, of course, we're going to get an error here, and the reason for that is we did not mark our base as public. So I'm going to come back to my enemy base, come down to my take damage. I'm going to mark this as public, like so. Go ahead and save it. I'll come back to my small enemy, and now if I hover over, it says that we have not fed it an argument for how much damage we're taking. So we need to know how much damage to take here. So we're going to do the other dot get component. And we want to get the bullet script. So bullet parentheses dot and then damage amount. Now you can see that this is going to get flagged because we haven't created it yet. So I'm going to plug in damage amount. I'm going to go over to my bullet. And then inside here, I'm going to create a public variable, public float damage amount, and however much damage I want this bullet to deal. So let's have it do 25. I'm going to save it. And I did this as a lowercase damage with a capital amount. So I'm going to come back over to my small enemy, just make sure I use the correct naming type. And now it is all happy in the world. Yay. So I can save that. Let's go back to our enemy base. Let's make an additional modifier to our take damage function here. So after our health has been depleted, we want the enemy to destroy itself. So we'll say if health is less than or equal to 0, then we want to destroy this dot game object. We'll just save that, come back over, and let's test it out. I'll select the enemy. Let's make sure that the enemy has the small enemy code. Very good. Now our small enemy code inherits our base, so we don't have to add that. And now we need to add the tag to our bullet. So let's go ahead and open up our bullet. I'm going to come up to the tag section here. Right now it's marked as untagged. I'm going to come down and add a new tag. And I'll hit on the list here, I'll hit the plus sign. I'm going to call this bullet. Awesome. I'll go back and grab my bullet. And then under the tag section, I can now add the bullet tag. And then I'll back out of there. Let's see what happens if we fire at our enemy. So if I fire, it passes through, but let's check to see if any damage has been taken. We'll select the enemy, and I'll hit this little drop down over on the side here, change it to debug. Let's take a look at the variables, and you can see the health is at 75. If I fire again, let's see what the health does. We're at 50, 25, and what happens with that last one? Boom, enemy's gone. Yay! But now we need to make sure that the bullet gets destroyed whenever it hits the enemy. So I'm going to jump back into the code here. Now let's go over to the small enemy. And then on this collision here, if we're indeed hit by a bullet, we'll take some damage and then we'll tell the bullet to destroy itself. So I'm going to add in the next line. I'm going to say destroy other dot game object. Now when I semicolon this, do you see how it moved this back? What that's telling us is that this destroy function is not part of our if statement. Okay? Your if statement is actually very nearsighted. It will not see more than one line of code if it has no braces. You can see this if, there are no braces here, so it has this piece as a child. This is its own thing. I want the if statement to see both of these things, so I need to go up to here and add a brace, and then hit enter. Go down to the bottom of this, hit enter, and add a brace. And now the if statement sees both of these, and I can save it. Make sure that we have our starting brace here and here, and then our if statement has its own braces. Let's test it. So now when the bullet hits the enemy, it should disappear. So we'll fire. Boom. Bullet gone. Did the enemy take damage? He did. And I'll fire again. Bam, 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 bam. Yay. Alright, I'll stop that. Let's set this back to normal. So hit the little breadcrumbs here. Change it from debug to normal. Goes back to our inspector. And one last thing we should do for our bullet is to specify how fast we can fire. So let's jump into the code here, and we'll go to the hero. And on the hero code, we'll go up to the very, very top. Let's do a private variable. I'll do private float, and this is going to be fire rate. I'll set that to, let's do 5F. I'll also do another private float. And this is the default fire rate. I'll do that as 5F. Okay, that looks good. Let's go on down into our fire rate here, or sorry, our fire bullet. And if we hit our keys, we want to make sure that this is happening. And so I go to the end of this, and I'll hit the double and sign. And I want to make sure that the fire rate is less than or equal to 0. Okay? And I want to make sure that this input and this input are being read as a single entity. To do that, I'm going to put a parenthesis in front of this and a parenthesis at the end of this one. So it's going to look at this and say, and it's going to say either of these and this. Okay? If we don't do this, there's a possibility that it will group the last two together, but ignore the first one. So we want to make sure it reads our inputs as a single, and then our fire rate as its own thing. Okay. So there's our fire rate, and we want to make sure that our fire rate gets reset every time we actually fire. So I'll go ahead and add a brace here, and then an ending brace. And whenever we fire our bullet, we're then going to reset our fire rate. So fire rate is going to be set to default fire rate. Looks good. But before we fire, we're going to go ahead and count down. So inside of our fire bullet, just before that, we're going to say if fire rate is greater than 0, then we want to count it down. So fire rate minus equals time dot delta time. So this will count down our fire rate if it's greater than 0. If it's less than or equal to 0, we'll be able to fire. We'll save it. I'll jump back in. So now if I fire, you can see nothing happens because I have to wait for that countdown. But now I can fire, and bam. It's taken me a little bit to get there, and then bam. That's a bit slow. Let's go ahead and start this off at 0. So we'll jump back into the code. Look up the fire rate. I'll set the starting fire rate at 0. And then my default fire rate, maybe I'll set this to 1. Go ahead and save it. And we'll do it in debug. So I'll grab the hero, change this to debug mode so I can see what the fire rate is. So my fire rate, alright, so my fire rate's 0 and it has a default rate at 1. I'll fire. And you can see how fast it counts down. So I can fire 1 every, what is that, second and a half or so. Let's adjust that, maybe 0.25. I'll run it again. So now I have a bit of a delay between each shot. And then, say like with a power-up or whatever not, we can always decrease the default fire rate. Let's go ahead and set this back to normal. And that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Make sure you save your work, and I shall see you next time. Hey guys, thank you for checking out my channel. Misty and I both thank you. If you enjoyed that video you just watched, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. Or if you want to support the channel, check me out on Patreon or pick up one of my books, Life and Times Down in Marton or The Guardian's Path of Ascension. Speaking of which, I'm converting The Guardians into a graphic novel / comic book series. Here is a sneak peek. My wonderful artist, Patrick, is doing a great job. I'm excited. I want to push this out as soon as possible. So definitely keep your ears and eyes open for that. I'll be making announcements as we get closer, and I'll post some shots of that as we go. And if you want to follow me on social media, you can check me out on Twitter. I guess now it's X. Who does that? It's BruceRF1 at Twitter, or at whatever the new thing for Twitter is. Anyway, hopefully see you there, and I'll see you guys next time.